Hi again, everybody. Going to talk some more, of course, about the Odyssey. We have a lot more to talk about in this very, very long, rich, strange, amazing work. Um, Easy to get a bit confused in reading the Odyssey because there's just so much going on. And the narrative has a kind of episodic structure, by which I mean it's really a whole set of stories that Homer is selecting from the Greek mythological tradition of talking about Odysseus, and he's weaving them together in a certain way. Um, I'm going to take, let's say, one trip through the material in this lecture, and as a result, we're going to be bopping around a fair bit in the text. But basically, what I'm going to try to do in this lecture is proceed, let's say, thematically rather than narratively. I want to try to bring out something that I think is consistently at stake in the Odyssey, even though we have to kind of pick it up from different portions of the story. And I want to get into it today just by asking us to reflect on what kind of world we're in when we are in the world of the Odyssey. What's it like? And I mean, in particular, what's it like morally? What kind of place is it? And I want to ask and answer this question quite freely in our terms. It's easy, of course, when we're reading a historical text to suppose that we should think about, well, how things were then or whatever. But let's not do that for now. Let's just use our perspective because really, in the end, that's the only perspective that we have. So, what kind of place is this? The world of the Odyssey? Well, in many ways, it is obviously not a very nice place at all, morally, civically, politically. We are obviously in a quite horrendously patriarchal world when we are in the world of the Odyssey. We are also in a world that is a slave society. Um, we are not necessarily in exactly a racist world, and of course the slave issue in the ancient world is actually not a race-based thing at all. However, we are certainly in a heavily ethnocentric world, by which I mean that Odysseus and his fellow Greeks take themselves and their way of life to be the way life should be. They are the only kind of people that really matters in the world as far as they are concerned. So, a patriarchal world, a slave world, an ethnocentric, if not racist, world, and, as we have discussed previously, a world of very, very dubious action on the part of the people, the men, whom Homer thinks of and calls heroes. Well, they're not very heroic from our point of view. When we finally kind of meet Odysseus and hear him talk in this text, and I'm going to be starting out now in Odyssey Book 9, going to be looking at Book 9 from line 43. This is where Odysseus is starting to tell his story, and the first story he tells, he's starting, that is, to tell his story of what happened after he left Troy at the end of the Iliad. So Book 9, again, I guess I'll pick it up from line 38, actually. Odysseus says, "Now let me tell you all the trouble Zeus has caused me on my journey home from Troy. A blast of wind pushed me off course towards the Cicones in Ismaras. I sacked the town and killed the men. We took their wives and shared their riches equally among us. Then I said we must run away. Those fools, that is Odysseus' men, refused to listen. They were drinking wine excessively and killing sheep and cattle along the beach. The Cicones called out to neighbors on the mainland who were strong and numerous and skilled at horseback fighting, and if need be on foot. They came like leaves and blossoms in the spring at dawn. Then Zeus gave us bad luck. Poor us. The enemy assembled round the ships and fought with swords of bronze. And while the holy morning light was bright and strong, we held them off, though they outnumbered us. But when the sun turned round and dipped, the hour when oxen are released, the Cicones began to overpower us Greeks. 6 well-armed members of my crew died from each ship. The rest of us survived, and we escaped the danger. We prepared to sail away with heavy hearts, relieved to be alive, but grieving for our friends. That's the first episode in his journey home from Troy that Odysseus tells us. And of course, it is an episode in which he reveals himself basically to be a murderous pirate. Or murderous Viking, maybe, might be an even better comparison. They're blown off course. They come to this town of people who are not Greek. So what do? Conquer the town, kill the men, take the women, take the wealth. It's absolutely horrible. There's no question about that. And, this is, I think, striking and something that we need to notice in 2 ways. First, a general way, the world of the Odyssey is a seriously immoral, if not amoral, world. Violent men doing terrible things to people. That's the world of the Odyssey. And second, even within that world, and this I think is really quite amazing, even within that world, Odysseus himself is presented as kind of a morally questionable figure. Odysseus is, strong and handsome and all that stuff, but he's also crafty, and that's a word that is constantly applied to Odysseus. Crafty or wily. He's a slippery character. He's often referred to as Lord of Lies in this text. And it's like, in a way, the text is admiring him for that. Oh, Odysseus, you're so full of it. I can't trust you. In a way, the text is admiring him for that, but in another way, the text is standing back from him on that account. It's like when you praise maybe a boxer for just being incredibly violent. That's sort of ambiguous. Or praise a gangster for being ruthless, even within the world of the Odyssey, then. Odysseus is presented as morally questionable. Now, I said I was going to bop around in the text a fair bit, and I am. I want to zip ahead on this point to book 19. So this is in the last portion of the text that I asked you guys to read. But I want to look at this bit now. It's book 19, and we're going to pick it up from, let's say, line 394. This is a story that we're told. It's a story within the story. This is a story that we're told about a trip that Odysseus took as a boy to visit his maternal grandfather, called a man called Autolycus. The text goes, Odysseus went there with his maternal cousins and grandfather, noble Autolycus, who was the best of all mankind at telling lies and stealing. Hermes gave him this talent to reward him for burning many offerings to him. Much earlier, Autolycus had gone to Ithaca to see his daughter's baby, and Eurycleia put the newborn child on his grandfather's lap and said, "Now name your grandson, this much-wanted baby boy." He told the parents, "Name him this. This is Autolycus, Odysseus' grandfather, I am disliked by many all across the world, and I dislike them back. So name the child Odysseus, and when he is a man, let him come to his mother's people's house by Mount Parnassus." It's like we're watching a kind of gangster movie here, or something, where, senior gangster, grandfather gangster is saying, "You know how many people around the world want me whacked?" Top boasting, right, about lies and deceit and crimes of various kinds, through which he has prospered, and for which he, Autolycus in the story, for which he is given sanction by a god. Hermes says it's okay. And so that's why he behaves the way he does. This man, Autolycus, gives Odysseus his name, and as we will learn from the introduction to our course text, this is a slightly difficult point, which we're not going to be able to get into, which I can't get into properly, so to speak. But the name Odysseus evidently is related to a Greek verb, which means to dislike or to hate. So he's carrying this name of moral questionableness through the Homeric world, which is itself questionable. And I'm going to try to wrap up this initial point fairly quickly. So again, the point I'm making is, first of all, the world of the Odyssey is a morally crappy world. And second of all, even within that world, Odysseus, in a sense, is specially morally crappy. You see? He's our good guy, our hero, if you like. But in many ways, he's actually an anti-hero, not a very good guy at all. Even this 10-year wandering back from Troy, 10 years fighting in Troy, 10 years wandering back home, desperately trying to get back to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, whom he abandoned as a baby. Well, yeah, if we actually, as it were, pay attention and read closely as we are going through the Odyssey, we're going to learn that of those 10 years, Odysseus spends 1 full year in the company of the gorgeous goddess Circe, feasting and having sex with her. He spends 7 full years in the company of the gorgeous semi-divine nymph Calypso, feasting and having sex with her. So let us do the math. That makes... it is funny, almost, if you think about it. That makes 8 years out of 10 in which Odysseus actually was not really trying to come home at all, but was, shall we say, otherwise occupied. So the heroic attempt to get back to his wife and son is not necessarily quite what it seems. Again, not especially heroic at all, at least not for those 8 years out of 10. Okay, let's move on. Let's round out this point and move on. As you guys will know from your reading, there is, in book 10 and 11 of the Odyssey, there is an incredible long episode, which we'll talk about more, where Odysseus and his companions actually sail to the underworld, because you can get there by boat in the Greek world. I'll talk about that next time. They go to the underworld and they meet various people, including a figure with whom we're already familiar from Sophocles, the prophet Tiresias, whose ghost, whose shade Odysseus meets and questions in the underworld. And Tiresias gives him a long prophecy of how he can make it home, what will happen, what kind of journey it will be. I will give you the section. I'm not going to read it. It's in book 11. Let's say lines 100 to 105. I won't turn to it. But it's a moment in which Tiresias says to him, okay, so I'm going to paraphrase. Tiresias says, yes, you can get home. Everything will be fine. You'll make it if, Tiresias says, if you can control your urges. If you can control your urges. So Tiresias, in that episode, in that passage, he, let's say, lays down a marker of restraint, of self-restraint in pursuit of a goal, restraint of desire, restraint of self-interest, restraint of the drive for power and pleasure. And we are able to see, I think, very readily that any serious conception of morality is going to include or be based on some idea of self-restraint, restraint of desire, restraint of selfishness, restraint of self-interest, restraint of those drives, again, for power and pleasure. It is very easy to see, if we glance over the stories of the Odyssey, that restraint of desire, restraint of urges, that is precisely what Odysseus and his men do not do. They are really, really bad at that. And in fact, they scarcely even try to restrain their urges. They scarcely even try to be moral in that way. And we can just think in this connection of the very famous episode that's given in Odyssey, Book 12. It's the episode of Odysseus and the Sirens. And I added a famous Greek image to the canvas page on this. Remember, the sirens are those beings in the guise of beautiful women who call out to you from the beach with a captivating song. Come here, Odysseus, we love you, Odysseus. And the song is so beautiful, so irresistible that you will go there. You will go to the sirens. And once you go, they kill you and they eat you. Odysseus and his men manage to get past the sirens. And of course, Odysseus stops his men's ears with wax, a very, very famous bit of the story. He stops his men's ears with wax so they can't hear the sirens. They just keep on rowing. Odysseus does not fill his own ears with wax, right? Rather, Odysseus has himself tied to the mast of his ship so he can hear the siren's song but not be able to go to them. What's the point of that story in the context of this discussion that we're having? Well, the point of the story, I think, is Odysseus, again, precisely does not control his urges. He has no capability, no thought almost of controlling his urges. Rather, as in that episode of the Siren Song, he enjoys his urges. He revels in his urges. He savors them. He's just smart enough to know that if he wants to get away with it, he has to take certain precautions, as he does when having himself tied to the mast so that he can hear that siren song. So, what kind of world? A world of pleasure, a world of self-interest, a world of power. This is a world that perhaps the best we can say at this level about the world of the Odyssey is that it is a morally flat world. And the worst that we might be able to say in that connection, and with justice, we'd be able to say that maybe the world of the Odyssey, a lot of the time, seems like a world containing no real morality at all, just pleasure, urges, power, and so on. Now, if there is another way, if there's another possibility, if there's a possibility of morality, it would, of course, involve controlling those urges, seeing beyond the self, seeing beyond self-interest in favor of some kind of higher moral law or moral imperative. And in the world of the Odyssey, I think there is exactly one pathway that runs throughout the text, and with which the text, I think, is actually fascinated and obsessed. One pathway toward an actual moral landscape, and that is the pathway of hospitality, the law of hospitality, or the wonderful Greek term xenia, Xenia. Of course, we see the scenario of xenia, or hospitality, over and over and over again in the Odyssey. It's a scenario, a process, let's say, that always begins with the appearance of a stranger at the door. I mean, a stranger at the door, that's potentially a threat. Even today, if somebody comes to our house, somebody whom we don't recognize. In the ancient world, perhaps a stranger at the door might naturally generate an urge to drive that stranger away with violence. But xenia, hospitality, says no, you can't do that. You have to restrain your urges and instead follow a procedure which is laid down by this kind of moral law, the law of hospitality. And again, we see this over and over again in the Odyssey. We actually kind of learn how to be hospitable in ancient Greek terms in the Odyssey. It's quite a formal procedure, which we can break down into a series of stages. As far as I can tell, there's 7 stages of Xenia. You guys don't need to know that. And you might even have a different count. I don't know, but this is how I'm going to break it down. First of all, you see the stranger. You perceive him outside your door as a stranger. We already have had a very, very clear example of this procedure of Xenia in Odyssey Book 1, when Telemachus looks out his door and sees that old man standing there. It's actually the goddess Athena, but it looks like an old man who turns out to be a guy called Mentes, remember? So you see the stranger, and you must welcome him in. That's step 1. You rush to the stranger outside your door. You say, oh, come on in. Come on and have dinner. You can't stand outside like that. Stage 2, you relieve the stranger of his burdens, which may mean outerwear, may mean bags, may mean a weapon. Telemachus, in that Book 1 episode, he takes Mentes' bronze spear. Now that's a kind of double-edged gesture. The stranger is not allowed to come into your house with weapons. Nonetheless, in terms of Xenia, you're helping him out. You're, oh, let me take that. Let me take your bags, take your coat, and yes, I'll take your bronze sword or your spear. Stage 2 of the process. Xenia. Stage 3, you sit the stranger down. You make him comfortable inside your house. Still as a stranger, by the way. You don't know who this is yet. At this 3rd stage, there's often a ritual washing. It may be a washing of feet. Sometimes it's a complete bath, and then an anointing with oil. And why this is, I don't know. The Greeks seem to have been convinced that after you've had a nice hot bath, the next thing you really want is to pour oil all over yourself. I don't quite get that, but that's how they did it. Anyway, so where are we? We've welcomed the stranger, stage 1. We've relieved him of his burdens, stage 2. We've sat him down and made him comfortable and cleaned him, stage 3. Stage 4, a meal. Always meat and wine and bread. That's what they eat. It's high-class food, high protein, high input food. As we were discussing in my tutorial this week, it is really quite amazing that these people spend basically their entire lives either crossing the ocean or next to it. They almost never eat anything that comes out of that ocean. They don't eat fish, these heroes. They eat meat, sheep, pigs, cows, and so on. Meat, wine, bread. At stage 4, you give the stranger, and only then, at stage 5, do you ask the stranger's name, and you get to know him. Very typically in the Odyssey, and this is something I want to come back to, very typically in the Odyssey, it actually turns out that you already know the stranger. But in any case, you know, once you learn his name, the stranger becomes a guest, or in the wonderful Greek, well, not Greek, the wonderful phrase that we have in our translation, he becomes a guest friend, establishing a bond which it seems will last lifelong and even be passed down afterlife from generation to generation, as a guest friend of your father becomes your guest friend. But we're not done. There is a 6th stage, at which you basically ply the guest friend with further comforts, a bed, another bath, whatever. And finally, stage 7, very, very important, you send the stranger on his way, not keeping him prisoner. You send him on his way, usually with some kind of gift. That's the procedure of Xenia as we see it over and over and over again in the Odyssey. Each part of this procedure is important. Each part must be done right. Each part can go wrong. Again, this is a scenario, a procedure, a kind of basic moral law that runs throughout the text, and with which the text, I think, is largely fascinated. Now, that brings us to the central portion of the narrative of the Odyssey. Basically, we're talking here about books 9 through 12, where Odysseus actually tells the story of his wanderings after Troy, minus the 8 years with goddesses. So it's really the 2 year wanderings of Odysseus, first of all with his men and then by himself after they all are killed. They go through a series of adventures, all of which have become extremely famous, canonical, as we say. All the stories of Odysseus' wanderings have been told and retold in subsequent literature, film, and so on. And we are able, in the context of this discussion, to make what I think is a worthwhile generalization about the nature of Odysseus's adventures, or rather misadventures, because they almost all turn out very badly. These terrible things that happen to Odysseus and his men, they are all in various ways disastrous or distorted experiences of xenia, hospitality. Xenia going wrong. That's what we see over and over again as these Greeks, Odysseus and his men, kind of present themselves at this or that island that they come to in the Mediterranean. They kind of show up and go, "Hi, we're here. We'd like some xenia, please." And of course, they get the very opposite. The first one that we need to talk about, it's from Book 9, the really, I think, stunning episode of the Cyclops. The Cyclops being a one-eyed giant and member of a race of one-eyed giants, to whose island Odysseus and his men arrive in Book 9. They find his cave, they go in there, they sit down, they wait, so that when the Cyclops comes home, they can get some xenia. What they get instead, of course, is imprisoned by that Cyclops. He won't send them on their way. You see, that's already a violation of the hospitality law. And it's much worse than that, because rather than feeding them a meal, the Cyclops makes them the meal, snatches them up 2 at a time, eating them alive, and clearly and explicitly making it his plan to eat them all. That leads, of course, to the very, very stunning episode, which I don't think I'll read because there's just too much work for us to do here, but it's in Book 9, let's say from line 380 down to 400 or so, the incredible story and the horrible story of Odysseus blinding the Cyclops. He gets him drunk, makes a great big long spear of olive wood, heats it in the fire, and then he and his men grind it into the Cyclops' one eye, blinding him. In Book 10, Odysseus and his men encounter more giants. They're called the Lastrygonians. The persistent fantasy, the nightmare fantasy of meeting giants in the Odyssey, it's not that hard, I think, to understand. These men, these violent murderers and pirates, they make their way through life on a basis of power. When they meet giants, obviously their power is belittled and negated. And the Lastrygonians in Book 10, they also just start eating them, helping themselves to these hapless Greeks, chowing down on them alive. And the third episode that I want to mention is, of course, the episode of the goddess Circe in Book 10. And I will read a little bit here, Book 10 from line 229. So they've arrived again at a strange island. They're hungry. They see a kind of palace with smoke rising from a chimney. And as though they haven't learned anything yet, they show up. Odysseus is not actually with this group, but his men show up as though saying, "Hi, we're here, we're Greek, we'd like some Xenia, please." What they get instead is this. So book 10, line 229, they shouted out to her, to Circe. She came at once, opened the shining doors, and asked them in. So this is going pretty well so far. The Xenia procedure is being followed so far. So thinking nothing of it, in they went. Eurylochus alone remained outside, suspecting trickery. He has learned something. She led them in, set them on chairs, and blended them a potion of barley, cheese, and golden honey mixed with Pramnian wine. She added potent drugs to make them totally forget their home. They took and drank the mixture. Then she struck them, using her magic wand, and penned them in the pigsty. They were turned to pigs in body and voice and hair. Their minds remained the same. They squealed at their imprisonment, and Circe threw some mast and cornel cherries, food that pigs like rooting for in muddy ground. In the Circe episode, again, initially it seems like the procedure of Xenia is being followed, and then all of a sudden it is distorted, it's inverted, it's turned on its head as they are turned into pigs, which we can think about just a little bit. And again, it's not super hard. A pig is precisely a prey animal, a domestic animal. It's one of those animals that you slaughter and grill and put on the table for the meal that is supposed to be provided when the laws of hospitality are followed. And this is what happens over and over again in these nightmare episodes of Odyssey, books 9 through 12, through a dreadful distortion or inversion of Xenia. These guests become prey. Rather than being treated to a meal, they become the meal. Rather than being treated as guest friends, they find themselves on the grill, literally or metaphorically. And in fact, if we go through the whole story and kind of take inventory, we will find that almost all of Odysseus's men in the end meet the same kind of gruesome fate, which is a fate of actually being eaten alive. The stranger, the guest, becoming the meal rather than being treated to one. So, what have we got so far? Well, we have an immoral or amoral world, the world of the Odyssey, a world with, as I said, exactly one powerful, promising moral pathway, preserving people just from the sheer ocean of naked power and desire. That's the pathway of Xenia. The text and this world cling to the hope of Xenia, let's say, and yet through the misadventures of Odysseus and his men, we see how incredibly fragile, what a sort of piece of shipwreck wood, what a tiny hope that is that they cling to as they are swept around in the swirling ocean of this immoral world. So it's like Xenia is at the center of this text as a hope, but also as a problem. And I want to go on now in the remaining portion of this lecture and note something else that occurs in the situation of Xenia, something that I think is really quite cool, and something that then expresses why this hospitality scenario is so persistently at the center of the action of this text. So I want to go back now to book 4. I'm going to be looking at book 4 from around line 91 and down to around line 121. I'm not going to read all of it, but that's where we are. This is where Telemachus, Odysseus' son, He's on that trip, remember, that I talked about last time, trying to get news about his dad. And in this episode in Book 4, he's visiting with Menelaus and Menelaus's wife, Helen. And here, Book 4, line 91, Menelaus is talking, and he says, "I can take no joy in all my wealth. Whoever they may be, your fathers have surely told you how much I have suffered." Remember, Telemachus at this stage is still the stranger. He's still at what I am calling stage 4 of Xenia. He's been welcomed in, he has been washed, he has been relieved of his burdens, he has been given a meal, but he has not yet identified himself. His name has not yet been given. So Menelaus is talking to this young stranger. From line 93 or so, "I was parted for many years from all my splendid riches. I wish I had stayed here, with just a third of all the treasure I have now acquired, if those who died at Troy, so far away from Argive pastures, were alive and well. I sit here in my palace, mourning all who died, and often weeping. Sometimes tears bring comfort to my heart, but not for long. Cold grief grows sickening. I miss them all, but one man most. When I remember him, I cannot eat or sleep, since no one labored like him, Odysseus. His destiny was suffering, and mine the endless pain of missing him. We do not even know if he is still alive. He has been gone so long. His faithful wife and old Laertes must grieve for him, and young Telemachus, who was a newborn when he went away." These words roused in the boy a desperate need to mourn his father. Tears rolled down his face and splashed down on the ground. He lifted up his cloak to hide his eyes, but Menelaus noticed and wondered whether he should wait until the boy first spoke about his father or ask. And as this episode goes on, Helen comes in. They see how moved Telemachus has been by the mention of his father. They see Telemachus crying and trying to hide it because of the mention of his father. And because they see that reaction, they figure it out. They figure out who he is. They start to say, "Hey, you look kind of familiar. Don't you think, Helen, he looks an awful lot like Odysseus?" "Yes, he does, Menelaus. I think he looks an awful lot like Odysseus." And so they figure out Telemachus' identity, and Telemachus finally comes clean, so to speak. Says, "Okay, yes, I'm actually Odysseus' son, Telemachus." So the story of Odysseus moves Telemachus, makes him cry. That moving, that reaction, allows his hosts to identify him, to change him from being a stranger to being a guest friend, whose name they know and to whom they then are bound. And there's a very similar episode, longer and even much richer and cooler, which begins at the very end of Book 8. I didn't actually ask you guys to read Book 8, but I just want to include a little bit of what happens here. It's going to be Book 8 from around line 470. So Odysseus, at this point in the story, Odysseus is sitting in the palace of the king of the Phaeacians, and again, he is the stranger at stage 4 of Xenia. He is not yet identified. He has been welcomed in, he has been cleaned, he has been given a meal, he has been given wine. And at that point in this particular hospitality episode, something very, very interesting happens, which is a poet comes on, a poet called Demodocus. And Odysseus precisely asks Demodocus to sing, to provide that oral performance, to follow up the meal. And Demodocus starts to sing, of course, precisely about the Trojan War. And I'm going to read this, Book 8, from line 500. Homer writes, "A god inspired the bard to sing. He started with how the Greeks set fire to their camp and then embarked and sailed away. Meanwhile, Odysseus brought in a gang of men into the heart of Troy inside the horse, the Trojan horse. The Trojans pulled the thing up to the summit and sat around discussing what to do. Some said, 'We ought to strike the wood with swords.' Others said, drag it higher up and hurl it down from the rocks. But some said they should leave it to pacify the gods. So it would be. The town was doomed to ruin when it took that horse, chock full of fighters bringing death to Trojans. And he sang how the Achaeans poured from the horse, in ambush from the hollow, and sacked the city, how they scattered out, destroying every neighborhood. Like Ares, Odysseus with Menelaus rushed to find Deiphobus' house, and there he won at last through dreadful violence, thanks to Athena. So the poet sang. Odysseus was melting into tears. His cheeks were wet with weeping, as a woman weeps, as she falls to wrap her arms around her husband, fallen fighting for his home and children. She is watching as she gasps and dies. She shrieks, a clear high wail collapsing upon his corpse. So what's happening here? We're in the scene of Xenia, or hospitality. Odysseus, the stranger, has been welcomed in. He has been unburdened. He has been fed. The bard sings. Odysseus cries. He's moved. He reveals himself. And turning the page in Book 9, at line 20, we then find himself coming clean again, saying who he is. I am Odysseus, Laertes' son, known for my many clever tricks and lies. So what's the point here? The point is that the scene of Xenia, of hospitality in the Odyssey, not only is this kind of unique moral pathway that seems to exist in the world of the poem, Xenia also seems to have a very particular and repeated function, a function that comes along as a result, let's say, of the hospitality procedure. What we're watching when we watch Telemachus getting moved, or when we watch Odysseus getting moved, what we're watching, of course, is the kind of thing that Aristotle, we know, calls catharsis, that purging of negative emotions that occurs when watching a tragedy, according to Aristotle. But the point for our purposes is, it's exactly that moment in the hospitality procedure, the procedure of Xenia. It's exactly that moment that leads to and allows and even, let's say, compels recognition. When a story is told and the stranger is moved by the story, and it's precisely by being moved by the story that the stranger names himself, reveals himself, and in so doing, he is recognized. He is recognized as actually already known. The stranger becomes a guest or a guest friend. The point I'm trying to make to wrap up is this. Xenia, this central Homeric procedure, has a certain goal, and the goal is precisely recognition. Xenia makes it possible for the stranger to be known, makes it possible for the stranger to become a guest. And one thing I think that means for our purposes is that the incessant repetition of Xenia in the Odyssey, of that scenario of hospitality, it is an incessant reaching for or yearning for recognition, yearning for that moment when the stranger becomes a guest. And I think that's in part because that's a moment, let's say, of a kind of incipient morality. When the stranger becomes a guest, you can't kill him anymore. When the stranger becomes a guest, the moral law has intervened, has transformed your life and his. But it's also, I think, because the Odyssey as a text, through Xenia, has, as I've already said, a kind of craving for recognition, a yearning for recognition, for that moment when somebody can be seen for who they are, somebody can be known. And it's, of course, very cool, I think, and moving that in these episodes we've been looking at, the stranger doesn't only come to be known, rather it turns out the stranger is already known. So we have Menelaus and Helen going, "Oh, you're Telemachus, of course." We have the Phaeacians in Book 9 going, "Oh, you're Odysseus, the very guy we just were talking about." There's something very tantalizing there, consistent with the previous discussions we've had about the nature of recognition. It is as much a knowing again or a re-knowing as it is a learning of something new. And a final point to round out this lecture on the Odyssey. There is an element in the Xenia procedure that I may have left out in the breakdown of the stages I gave before, because it doesn't always occur. But it does occur. It is included in these two episodes we looked at. Telemachus in Book 4 and Odysseus in Books 8 and 9. The element is the telling of a story. Literature itself intervenes in the hospitality procedure, and it's through literature precisely that the stranger is moved. It's through a story that the stranger is moved, experiences some kind of catharsis, and therefore reveals himself, allowing recognition to occur. So we have a kind of insight here in our ancient text, the Odyssey, about the profound power of literature itself to foster procedures of recognition, allowing them to occur. And we can push this final point yet one more step before we wrap up today. The Odyssey, obviously, is the story of Odysseus. And in the Odyssey, as we have been seeing in this lecture, in the Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus, recognition occurs through the telling of stories in a hospitality context. The story through which recognition occurs in the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus, is precisely the story of Odysseus, which is the Odyssey. You see? The very text that we are reading is the text that generates that moment of recognition in the context of Xenia, Odysseus' own story. First invoked, let's say, by Menelaus to Odysseus' son Telemachus, and then actually told, sung by the poet Demodocus to Odysseus himself, who is sitting right there, and therefore is compelled to weep and reveals himself. That's a very cool, very kind of trippy effect of the Odyssey, I would say. And it leaves us with a number of avenues to go down in terms of how we can further discuss this text. For the moment, and to wrap up this lecture, I just want to point out that for the Odyssey itself to be the text through which recognition occurs in the Odyssey itself, for that to be the case means, I think, or underlines just how incredibly important these two interlocked concepts are in the world of the Odyssey. The concept of Xenia or hospitality, and the concept of recognition that Xenia or hospitality allows. And I guess to come back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of the lecture, this is kind of the pathway that I think we need to go down when we're reading the Odyssey, not noticing, so to speak, the very nasty moral flotsam and jetsam that is bumping up against the sides of our ship, so to speak, as we pursue this line of thought. Nothing could be more important to this text than that moment of recognition. And by that token, I think nothing could be more difficult for this text, for the world of this text to understand than recognition. Which is why it comes up again and again and again and again. So we have our central value, our central thematic, the thematic of recognition, having, I think, a unique importance in the world of the Odyssey, and also being, by that token, uniquely difficult for the world of the Odyssey to grasp or keep a hold of. Okay? And in the next lecture, and perhaps next couple of lectures, I want to try to talk about why recognition is such a challenging concept for the world of the Odyssey. I think we're able to say some interesting things about that, but I'll leave that for next time. Okay, thank you very much as always.